Happy New Year. I hope your 2020 is starting off with a bang. Thank you for listening to Author Stories through 2019 and all of the previous years. We had an amazing year last year and looking forward to doing bigger and better things this year. Before we get into the interview, we're going to thank a couple of sponsors who make the show possible. Please give them a shout out and look them up on Amazon and make sure that you tell them that you appreciate their sponsorship of Author Stories. At the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War. This audio clip is narrated by the one and only Luke Daniels. You're going to love this series. I love it so much. And Richard has been a great supporter and sponsor of the show, and we're going to show him some love. Listen to the audiobook excerpt. You're going to love it, and be sure to go to audible.com to purchase it. If you're not an Audible subscriber, you can get a free book just by signing up for a free trial at audibletrial.com/Hank. You get a 30-day free trial. You get the free book. If you decide to cancel your Audible subscription, you get to keep the free book, and it doesn't cost you a single penny. audibletrial.com/Hank, and listen after the show for the clip from Richard Fox. We're so happy to have our friend Crystal Pico Watanabe as a sponsor of the show. Crystal is one of the best editors in the business, and she has just debuted a new service that I think you'll absolutely love and will help you to up your writing game. Pico's School of Wordcraft and Editing has just debuted, and the first course is called Properly Punctuating Dialogue. It's a mini course and can be completed in just about 20 minutes. It covers the basics of dialogue punctuation. Authors can get access to the new school and the course for free by signing up for Crystal's author newsletter, Notes from Pico. Go to picoshouse.com/newsletters. That's picoshouse.com/newsletters. More in-depth courses will be added in 2020. Make sure you don't miss a thing. picoshouse.com/newsletters. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2 are only 99 cents for a limited time. The gods are rightfully imprisoned, and Cess intends to keep them that way. But her terrorist father has other plans. Gregory D. Little's Unwilling Souls is a pulse-pounding chase through an epic fantasy world of adventure, sinister conspiracy, and a magical industrial revolution fueled by harvested human souls. Cess is the daughter of powerful parents who would very much like to kill one another and who therefore pretend she doesn't exist. An apprentice jailer of the gods, Cess spends her days learning to forge the tools needed to maintain the gods' prison. When her terrorist father attacks the prison on her 16th birthday, Cess is forced to flee after the secret of her parentage is revealed. Suddenly on the wrong side of the law, Cess realizes the very father who abandoned her may be the only one who can protect her. But some secrets are darker than parentage. On her way to find her father, Cess will uncover truths about her family and herself that will shatter her understanding of the world and risk the return of the gods themselves. Unwilling Souls and its sequel, Ungrateful God, are on sale now for only 99 cents. The third book of the series is coming early next year, so now is the perfect time to get up to speed. Unwilling Souls by Gregory D. Little. Books 1 and 2, only 99 cents for a limited time. Writers, I have an amazing tool to tell you about. A revolutionary writing tool for planning stories, Campfire Pro is what novelists need to go from the seed of an idea to a detailed plan that's ready to be executed. Complete your character design, create a timeline, and track your world building all in one place with our downloadable desktop app for Mac and PC. Without the annoying subscription model so many apps are using today. Visit campfiretechnology.com for special holiday pricing on Campfire Pro today. Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Julie does not love being the center of attention. She makes dresses for those who do. But when Emily, her matchmaking friend, begs for a favor, Julie can't say no. It was supposed to be just one date. She never expected to kiss the guy, then fall head over heels for him. When threats start rolling in, it becomes clear someone will do whatever it takes to break them apart. Now she's in too deep, and walking away isn't an option. But with the paparazzi and drama involved, Julie cannot help but wonder, who wants to love a billionaire? Hollywood producer Harry Jackson is not an alpha male. He's goofy, sensitive, and will move mountains to make everyone happy. In fact, he requires a whole team of people to keep him from being robbed blind. Sometimes he even needs saving from his love of bad puns. But when an enemy threatens to jeopardize his chance at love, it's time to step up and fight. He's terrified, but the thought of losing Julie scares him more. Pick up Who Wants to Love a Billionaire? The Billionaires in New York, Book 1 by Laura Burton. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Chris McCormick on the show with me today. He has a fantastic new book. It's called The Gimmicks, and this is one of the most unique reads that I've had in quite a while. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. Chris, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's a great question. My first memory of wanting to be a storyteller probably has to do with playing with my sister. We would cut out models from catalogs and invent families and stories and a lot of drama, probably influenced by the soap operas that my sister liked to watch. And they were not good stories, I wouldn't say, but they were time. I mean, we would spend hours playing with these cutout models and furniture. We'd have to get, all sorts of upgrades to their living situations. So it was a very low rent kind of video game, basically.
I love it. Love it. Were you a bookish kid?
I was, as a youngster, yes. I was obsessed with going to the library and reading, like, particularly classics. I kind of skipped young literature and went right to the classics, and was a nerd in that way, especially like Treasure Island, like some of those young adult classics especially. So I was really into that. And then I think this is the case for at least a lot of the writers I'm friends with. There was a phase there, basically from middle school through high school, where other interests took over and books kind of took a back seat. And music was primarily the case for me. I became a musician and wanted to just play in my band, and that was basically it. And then it wasn't until my first semester of an English course in college where a really enthusiastic teacher got me back into reading, and it's been that life for me since.
Wow. So many questions I want to ask you after that. The time you spend as a musician, I'm always fascinated by how creative pursuits inform each other or overlap. Your time as a musician, do you feel like learning to play in a group setting and then perform in front of people and get that audience feedback? Do you feel like that those things have influenced your writing at all? Is there any connection that you can feel there? Or do you feel like that time as a musician maybe built confidence? Or do you feel any connection there between those artistic pursuits?
Yeah, it's funny because the process is so different for the two, at least it was for me, where that band setting of collaboration and improvisation and playing off of each other was so exciting to me. But it was also what made me want to do a writing career as well, because I wanted a little bit more control. So in some ways the process is exactly inverted, where the writing life is so solitary and you have all of the control, and you can revise and revise until you think it's ready to share with anybody else. But you're right, though, that the idea that just performing and finding your voice, finding a version of yourself that you want to put out there for other people to interact with. I think that process is probably, at least in subtle ways, really, really important for the development of my writing voice.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely.
That college teacher or professor who turned you back on to the love of stories, How long did it take for you to realize that there were stories that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, the big thing about that professor, I should name him, I guess, Scott Covell. And the big thing about his teaching style was that he kind of reverse engineered the question of influence. So he would teach living writers and then kind of teach the writers that influenced those books and kind of reverse chronology teach so that it wasn't so daunting to get into the classics right away and start from there. We would start with, the kind of end result and then work our way back. And that was such a great, I thought, a great kind of pedagogical model of teaching literature. But, it was Louise Erdrich, Sherman Alexie, Toni Morrison, these living writers at the time that were writing about communities and people who in some ways belonged to those communities and in other ways were secretly totally strangers to their own communities. And it was that dynamic between belonging and not belonging that I finally connected with as a half Armenian who looks white and talks like all my friends at school did, and in some ways fit in like exactly the way that you would expect me to. At home, I had this secret life with this secret language and secret food and secret culture, and so when I was with my Armenian family, I felt like I belonged more with my white friends at school. And then when I was with my white friends at school, I felt like I belonged more with my Armenian family. And so there was this kind of borderland life that I recognized in the work of my favorite writers that I connected to very strongly.
And that dual identity struggle really comes out in the Gimmicks, your new novel. And I learned so much that I was not expecting to, not prepared to with this book. It's so fun in a lot of ways. It's so cheeky in a lot of ways, and so kind of heartbreakingly real, all at the same time. This didn't just happen overnight. A book like this doesn't just come out of a whim. What were some of the first things that you started writing, and did you discover a kind of trajectory for what your writing career would become?
Yeah, well, thank you for the compliments. I'm, the thing that really drew me to this idea was I wanted to write about the Armenian Genocide, which still a lot of Americans don't know much about, and it's such a heavy topic. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire killing 1.5 million Armenians, and modern day Turkey still denying that genocide ever took place, and so it's very political and dark and intense. And I knew I wanted to write about it without feeling like I was just explaining the historical facts, which, right, no matter how important they are, it's just not a very interactive experience as a reader. And so I had to find a way.
And it's such a heavy topic too that some people won't come to the material at all because they just don't want to be bummed out, and you have to find a way. And you found the perfect way to allow story to carry us into that.
Yeah, exactly. And that was my hope. So for me, I had to find a tonal balance, right? And for that, I wanted to go the extreme opposite of that dark, intense historical world. And so for me, it was professional wrestling, this other kind of mythology in my family that was totally adventurous and stupid and fun and just, everything is turned to 11, and it's about the performance of justice, not about the real thing. And something about conflating those two extremes created this energy that allowed this book to have all of that historical information in it without it feeling like a history text. And at least for me, it really does feel like an adventure story.
So the Armenian Genocide, was this a topic that was talked about at home with your family? How did you learn about it? As a kid growing up in America, and what were some of the stories that were told?
Yeah, so my great grandfather watched his father beheaded in the streets while he was hiding in the limbs of a tree. So
Oh my God.
that image of my family's lineage was one of the first horror stories that I ever heard, and I was very young. And those stories are pretty common in the diaspora, in the Armenian diaspora. So it's definitely the most central story in the Armenian identity, at least in the diaspora, where passing on the truth when it's denied elsewhere is vital for the community's survival. So yeah, it's a tough thing to listen to as a kid, you can imagine.
Sure.
But it's also, I think, a reason that I was so trained to pay attention to questions of justice and injustice, and how the past is not really the past at all, and it's still with us. So I think those elements have helped me become a writer.
Well, before the Gimmicks, you wrote another book. Before that, Desert Boys. What was this book, and where did it come from?
Yeah, Desert Boys is a linked short story collection. So it's all about this fictionalized version of my hometown, which is Lancaster, California, which is in the Mojave Desert on the western edge of the Mojave Desert in California. So it's one of those strange places that was like a very tiny population, maybe 20,000 people tops in this gigantic swath of desert. And then overnight, millions of people basically descended upon it from Los Angeles. And the town became a city really overnight. And that was happening as I was becoming an adult, or I guess an adolescent. So the way I thought about it was I was kind of going through puberty as my town was going through a kind of puberty at the same time. And those overlapping transformations created this extremely weird collection of dissonances and problems and also a lot of humor, I thought. So I wanted to write about that. So that's what Desert Boys turned out to be.
That's what a great juxtaposition of the growth of a town, while the growth and maturity of a young man. When you finished that and published that, and then you turned your attention toward the Gimmicks, was the Gimmicks a story that you had been planning to tell or wanting to tell for a while? And what was it that let you know that you were ready for this book?
Yeah, I knew that I wanted to get into the material of the Armenian legacy that I've grown up with, but I didn't know how until I started following these characters that I'd invented. For some reason, they wanted to get into the professional wrestling world, and so they went from the desert to Los Angeles and started training with this Armenian pro wrestler named Avo. And in the first draft of the book, the main characters were those two kids from the desert just learning how to wrestle. But as the book developed, I realized that Avo was actually the central character. And so I like to think that I wrote Desert Boys, and then I needed that literal drive from these fictional characters to drive away from the desert, and they arrive at the main character of my next book. It was kind of a bridge for me. And once I realized that Avo was the center of the book and not these kids, then the book became a lot less about wrestling than I thought it was going to be at first. So I think much to the relief of my editor.
So the book centers around this family and these cousins. You got Ruben and Avo that you talked about, and also a girl that they're both interested in. And we follow them through life's changes and physical changes, physicality changes. Where did the idea for this family come from? And Avo you mentioned, but where did the rest of this story? How did it start forming?
Yeah, I wanted a group of young Armenians who had very different ideas of what justice looked like. So Ruben is a much more militant character who thinks that justice and vengeance are almost indistinguishable. But Avo has, I think, a little bit more of a nuanced idea of what justice might look like. And the title of the book, The Gimmicks, comes from the wrestling term for the character that a performer portrays. And so they're putting on this gimmick. The question is how much of ourselves is performed and how much of ourselves is authentic. I think, the question of Mina, the female character you're talking about, she's inherited this societal role, this gimmick that she has to perform, and she's not pleased to perform that role. So while she has her own ideas of what justice looks like, she's kind of stuck at home. So I was really interested in playing with the different roles that people play in their families, in their nations, in their societies, and how that might change over time.
Well, what's really interesting is the character of Ruben, who, like you said, is kind of militant and takes this this idea of identity and goes in a completely opposite direction of Avo. And what we realize is, we all have a part to play. And in his, political militancy, he's putting on a character in much the same way that Avo is, but just a completely different expression. But when you start pulling back the layers of things, it really shows that what am I trying to say? The idea of authenticity is really the heart of what this book is about to me, and just proving that we're all doing that to some extent.
Yeah, and how do you love someone, and how do you remain loyal to someone whose vision for justice is so different than yours, right? And yeah, I feel like that's a question I struggle with in life. So I definitely wanted to try to figure out something about it by dramatizing it in fiction.
Yeah. One thing that kept hitting me over and over through this book is, there really is some heavy subject matter that you're dealing with here. From the family and interpersonal relationships and our roles within those families, and up to the kind of larger set pieces of international relationships and geopolitical things that are going on. What really struck me is the way that you kept using humor to lighten the burden for the reader, because there can be some, the tone could be very heavy, but you very prolifically lightened the mood just when it needed to be. Could you talk a little bit about using humor and using levity to kind of let the reader off the hook every now and then, to kind of catch our breath and really endear us to the characters more?
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on that, and I'm thankful that you're talking about it, because I think part of it's natural. This is how my family tells stories. This is where I come from, and although it's true that there's devastation and evil, it's not complete. The world is not completely that. And it's partly the writer's job to capture the completeness of the world and not just parts of it. So that's just natural, I think. When it comes to craft and how you can use humor to accentuate deeper emotional responses, I'm really paying attention to that as a reader. Those are the places where I'm disarmed by laughing, and then suddenly the next page, now that I've been disarmed, can really get me. That kind of rhythmic kind of understanding of when to hold back, when to lighten, when to land that blow. I think that's just essential for great storytelling, at least the storytelling that really lands with me.
Sure. And, out of great tragedy, comes really great comedy a lot of times. And not that this is a comic book, but, that there's something about dark humor that hits especially close to home. And I think it can change the way we think about things if we can learn to laugh a little bit, to find the humor and the, even uncomfortable things can be humorous if done the right way. And for me, those are the things that stick with me later. If something that's attached to an emotion like that just hangs with you, and you really did an excellent job of that in this book.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about the character of Terry Angel Hair Krill. Where did this guy come from? He's such a larger than life character in the book.
Yeah, so Angel Hair is an old retired professional wrestling manager who narrates parts of this book. He's been contacted by someone from Avo's past and who's looking for Avo. You know, at the center of this book, there is a missing person story, basically. Avo has disappeared after leaving Armenia and after wrestling in America for a couple of years under Angel Hair. He's disappeared. And now Angel Hair has to put the pieces of that story together. And so he's an old carny. He lives in Seattle. He raises cats. He's basically, decided to live a solitary life. But as the book goes on, you understand why he has to tell this story, why he has to figure out what happened to Avo, because his story and Avo's intersected in a profound way for him that he's been avoiding understanding until now. And I think a lot of the humor that you were talking about in your last question comes from Angel Hair's visible, kind of grotesquerie of he's in many ways he has lived the gimmick that he's been given, but underneath that kind of grotesque veneer that he's been using as a shield, he's mourning his brother who died in the Korean conflict. He's made mistakes with an ex-wife. He's figuring out what he did with Avo and what his responsibility with Avo's disappearance might have been. And so I think part of the book's job is to put so much pressure on Angel Hair that what at first appears to be his full self starts to break away, and you start to see what's really underneath that gimmick.
The contrast of militant political extremism contrasted with professional wrestling is a little jarring at first to think of those two things, and the more the story unwinds, you start realizing that there's not a lot of difference at the heart of those things, which is kind of hilarious when you really start thinking about it. How much fun was this book to write when you kind of found what, not the gimmick, that would be too bad a pun, but the kind of what the kernel of the story was going to be and how you would contrast these characters. Did you settle on this kind of story, framework from the beginning? Is this something that you had to work to find? How did it kind of come together for you?
It was so much fun to write this book. Sometimes writing is not fun and it's just work. And there were moments in this book where that was true, but overall, this felt like the book I was meant to write at this point in my life. And part of that fun was discovering just how much seemingly these two totally, almost flamboyantly unrelated subjects had in common. I mean, in wrestling, you're performing fake pain, right? You're performing pain for the audience that you don't really feel, or you're not supposed to feel it if you're doing it right. But in the Armenian context, your pain is being accused of being fake by the people who deny the genocide. So there's this question of what do you do with your disbelieved pain? Where do you put that disbelieved pain? What does that do to your soul? What does that do to your soul over generations? And how can you explain that pain to people who say it doesn't really exist? How can you articulate that pain? How can you convince someone that it's real? And suddenly there was some very serious thematic connections that I was just, it wasn't like I had this idea and I wanted to shove it down people's throats. I arrived at that idea, and I think you can feel that discovery happening as you're reading the book. And if that's true, then you can feel like you're part of that discovery. You're going along with that with that story. And so I don't know. I can't describe a more fun experience in writing than to gain a deeper understanding of your subject as you're going, rather than imposing what you already know onto something.
Yeah, and that's why I asked, because it does come together so organically in the reading that it definitely gives that feeling. Coming from a family that has such a rich connection to this event, and obviously, a history that's been communicated to you through the years. When you began to write the story, did you get feedback from your family or ask for input, or did you keep this kind of closely held, until you got it finished?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been very fortunate to have a family that is very communicative and open, and so I've been asking questions and collecting information and collecting stories my entire life. So I didn't feel the need to go with a notepad or anything to get more answers. From my mother, for instance, who immigrated when she was 19 from Armenia. But I read everything I could get my hands on, every historical document, every book, every journal entry from contemporaries. And then I went to Armenia myself and did a little bit of research there too, all of which was comparing what I had imagined my entire life with the real thing. And it was really exciting and scary to have written the book, and then to look back and say, did I imagine it right? Or is it possible to imagine something correctly or incorrectly? Thankfully, I then gave my mother a copy of the book, and according to her, I did a good job, and that's important to me. So
that is, and you couldn't get a better endorsement than that.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Chris, when people get finished with this book and they close the back cover, other than maybe, getting a better love for backgammon, through the book, which is an inside joke if you, read the book, what do you hope people are left with, other than being entertained? Because this is a greatly entertaining book. I know we've talked about some heavy stuff, but this is a great read. But what do you hope people are left with when, 5 years down the road, when they think back on reading the Gimmick? What do you hope they're left with?
Well, I hope that they remember the characters and the relationships between the characters as fraught and complex and heartfelt, and difficult, as difficult as the relationships with the people that we love in real life are. But I think the larger thing I hope people get from the book is the idea that the apparent story is not the whole story. And underneath the apparent story, there is a hidden story. And that's true for everybody. And if this book reminds you of that, which you probably already know, but we need to be reminded of the things we know, I think. I think that would be a success.
Absolutely. The Gimmicks, when you're hearing this, is on sale everywhere now in hardback and Kindle edition and audiobook as well. I have not gotten to hear the audiobook, but I can only imagine that it's amazing. Chris, I love the book. I love what you're doing. We're going to put links to it in the show notes of this episode where everyone can buy their copy. If people are just learning about you and want to dig into more about you and all the great stuff that you do, is there a place they can connect with you online?
Yeah, they can go to chrismccormickauthor.com, or they can see me on Twitter at twitter.com/Chris_MCCORM.
Great. We're going to send everyone to see you, Chris. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you, Hank.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. Humanity's only hope of survival entered the solar system at nearly the speed of light. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed Answer Me over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra." I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, doc." Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to his ear, Mark stopped and looked around before deciding how to continue. Spiked ocotillo plants looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.